Hi everyone! So in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to draw a chocolate Labrador in pastels, and I'm also going to have lots of tips and techniques throughout this video that are going to be really focusing on how to build up that realistic fur texture. But before I jump into any fur texture, I always start off with the eyes first. Now for me this is where the expression and emotion stems from, so I do want to make sure that I've got the eyes right before I look at anything else on the portrait. You can see here that I'm using a nice variety of colours, but this eye is already looking three-dimensional, and that's because I've got my contrast right. The same with the eyelid area around that eye itself. My brights are really bright and the darks are really dark. This is automatically making it look like the eye has that three-dimensional sphere shape. Once I'm happy with the eye, that's when I start to move on to the fur around it. Now for me here, I want to be making sure when I'm drawing the chocolate Labrador that I get my colours accurate. This will automatically be falling down to my contrast, so you'll see here that I'm darkening up the browns and then I'm adding my mid-tone highlights where needed, but it's always about reinforcing the colour with the contrast. This goes hand in hand with any portrait, but I do find this particularly more important when I was working with this coat colour, just because it's very easy to get your muddying up of your layers. Now what that means is if you use a lot of black in too many instances within various layers of your building up process, you can end up washing out that brown colour. So your chocolate Labrador may not appear as vibrant and rich in colour as you might like. Now what I'm going to be doing is I am going to be creating a dedicated chocolate Labrador tutorial for my Patreon channel. This one here isn't available on my Patreon as this was a commission that I was asked to do, but because I've had a couple of questions asking how I do approach this fur texture and colour, layering up those beautiful colours, I am going to make a dedicated tutorial on my Patreon channel. So that's coming up very soon, but of course I will post all of my updates on that tutorial here as well. So when it comes to building up the fur texture, I'm still using my pan pastels for that base foundation, but look at how I'm reinforcing my colour. I use my pan pastels to get my vibrancy in place, those really nice rich colours, and then I'm gradually building up my details from there. I am using a mixture of Carbothello, Pitt, Derwent and Caran pencils, and just finding a balance between the few sets that I have. Now when I'm using 4 main sets here, I don't use any other brands at the moment, but when I am using those, I'm picking specific colours that I think are going to work with that reference photo. There are many browns that we have access to in those sets, but it's whether or not it is a warm brown or a cool brown. Now I have lots of tutorials on my Patreon channel that focus on how I select my colours, so if that's of interest I will link my Patreon in the description below. But here, for example, this Derwent pencil that I am using is about a subtle layer. I'm not using that to adjust the colour at all. I've already done that with my layers underneath. What that pencil is doing is providing a layer of subtlety with my first few layers of detail. It's only here with this Caran pencil that I start to add in some of my mid-tone highlights. This layering process is really important and I use it throughout any portrait. But when I was working on the chocolate Labrador, I did find that building up these light values gradually really did help to get that soft sheen of that fur whilst also maintaining that lovely rich brown colour. So if you've seen many of my other tutorials here on YouTube, you'll know that I do like to work in small sections. I find that I'm far more productive and effective with the way that I'm working, rather than blocking in one solid layer for the entire subject and doing that process with each layer on top. I do find that when I work in smaller sections, I am far more motivated because even at this stage here, if I decided to leave this portrait at the end of that drawing session, it already looks like that photograph. I am therefore so much more excited to pick up those pencils and carry on with that portrait because it's already looking like that dog. So if you do find that you are having a little bit of more of a hesitation, you're not quite sure where you should be working and you're having a little bit more of that doubt, it might be because you're working on too much of a larger area. Break that up into 1 or 2 square inches and you'll probably find that it's easier to tackle. Now, one thing that I talk about in all tutorials here on YouTube, and of course in depth in my Patreon tutorials, is the importance of your highlights and shadows. Where you are positioning those highlights and shadows, for instance between the eyes here, this is going to form the shape of that animal's face. So if we get those shadows and highlights in the wrong place, it will adjust what our portrait looks like, and it won't resemble as much like that animal. Now, of course, this is something that we always want to be paying attention to, but more so with pet portraits. The owner of that animal is going to know if the structure of the face isn't right, because it really does just completely change the entire animal's expression, the feel of the portrait and everything. So I do want to make sure that I've got the placement of my highlights and shadows right and accurate from that first stage. So before I move on to the rest of the face, if this video has been useful, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I'd be very, very grateful. If you'd also like to get notified of all of the tutorials that I upload here to YouTube, then don't forget to hit that subscribe and the bell button. So onto the nose. I do have a couple of dog nose tutorials here on YouTube. I'll link them in the description below if they're of interest. Now, what I want to do for the nose at the very first stage here is block in the shape. I'm not adding any details whatsoever, but you can see that it's already starting to look three-dimensional. Now again, just like with the fur, this is because I've positioned my shadows and highlights in the right place. I'm already indicating at what point the nostrils curve over, and then where it curves over to the top, flatter surface of the nose. And again, all of this, just like the fur, is all decided by where we've positioned those highlights and shadows. I have a video here on YouTube, and it's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in pastels. I'll also link that in the description below as well. And in there I talk about three main things: the fur length, the fur direction, and the fur thickness. Now, this area of the dog's face is a prime example of all of those things. The length of the fur here is shorter than anywhere else on the face, especially on the neck where you start to draw the part of the chest. Our pencil strokes have to be shortened here in order to replicate that correct fur texture. Now, with pastels, the way that we use our pencils, we are going to get a variation with how thick those lines are, and it's all going to be ranging and dependent on a few things. The length of the lead, how much pressure you're applying, the technique and where you're holding that pencil. All of these things come into account when you're drawing the type of fur texture for that reference photo. Now, in this situation, I'm not really working with overly sharp pencils, but I am making sure that I'm using very light pressure. I want to make sure that I don't have my lines that are appearing too thick, because I'll end up with something that's potentially a bit more of a denser fur coat, something maybe like a Border Collie or a German Shepherd. So I do want to make sure that I'm ranging my pencil strokes here to replicate that Labrador's fur texture. So if the pencil technique, how to get these fine details, is something that you would like to see in real time, then I have lots of tutorials available on my Patreon channel. Because my Patreon channel does focus on the pet portrait side of things as well as the wildlife subjects, it's got a really nice variety of dog breeds, cats and horses. Now, the reason why I wanted to do this is so that any of my Patreon members who would like to take on commissions of their own, they have a nice variety of content available so that they can put the tips and techniques that I've shared in those real-time tutorials into their own work. And because I alternate every month between a domestic pet and a wildlife subject, there really is something for everyone. Now, if you've got any art related questions, any questions about Patreon, then feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. So onto the body. Now for this, it's going to be a really good demonstration on the elements that I've spoken about when I showed you the face. So the fur length, the fur thickness and fur direction are all really important here. I have to lengthen my pencil strokes to make sure that I'm showing that this part of the fur is significantly longer than the fur on the face. If I were to keep my pencil strokes all of the same length, the fur here on the body is going to look a little bit more like a Staffordshire Bull Terrier. So that breed technically has a little bit more of a standard all over coat length. Whereas anything that's like this, or a Springer Spaniel, a Golden Retriever, a German Shepherd, their fur will get thicker and it will get longer as you go down to the neck, chest and the body. So here I have to make sure that I've replicated that. Now you can also see again just how good my contrasts are. I've got my shadows really dark and I'm now gradually building up my highlights. Now one thing with any reference photo that we really do need to focus on is the light source. Any portrait that I'm working on, I will really look at that photo, not zoomed in on my tablet at all. I'll look at the entire image and I will study exactly where that light source is travelling from. The reason being, when we're working on one section at a time, we don't want to be adding brighter highlights where they shouldn't be, because this will change the direction of that light source and then it might make the portrait look unbalanced. So of course that's something that we really do need to be aware of. So I want to be making sure that on the right side of the body compared to the left, is there a side that needs to be a little bit brighter with some of those details? And if so, I need to make sure that I add a couple more of my lighter layers. Again, as I say, this is going to vary depending on the reference photo that we're working from, but my main thing that I want to be focusing on with any portrait, doesn't matter what it is that I'm drawing, is my contrast. The colour, although it's important, I find it's not as important as the contrast and your values. Now, I actually took the reference photo for this dog and I took hundreds, I took so many of all three of them, that the colour of each dog varied quite considerably from each photo. Now that could have been because the clouds went over the sun, it's changed the general warmer colours of the coat because of that. I didn't use a flash because I didn't want to overexpose any of the sections of fur, but there are so many things that can vary the colour of that reference photo. What I do want to make sure of though is again those contrasts. That's what's going to make the fur look thicker, look more realistic. The colour I find will come naturally if you get those contrasts right early on. Now as I said before, when I worked on the face, my pan pastels I have relied on for the colour for the bulk of that base layer. You can see here as I'm starting to map that in that I am hinting at where some of my warmer redder browns are compared to ones that are a little bit more pale. Mapping in your base layer like this and not putting one solid colour down is a really good way of making sure that we follow that reference photo accurately right from that very first stage. Now I put a lot of focus on my base layer stage because it is our foundation for our details. That doesn't mean that we can't alter it as we go, because pastels are very forgiving. If we do make a mistake, it's very easily resolved. But I do find that mapping in that base layer as accurately as I can at that early stage does make me hesitate less. I'm therefore far more efficient with how I work and I don't get nowhere near as caught up in the things like where we'd be thinking, where do I start? You have a little bit of a mind blank. Now if that happens, it might be because you're not putting as much of that variation, mapping in your lights and your darks at that early stage. And when you end up with something that's more of a solid colour, you do end up having to go back in and freehand more of your lights and your darks. Now that process and the way that we are going through that in our mind in itself is enough to slow us down and make us hesitate. And for me, this is what happened when I used to work more with my solid layers. I never mapped it in with one solid layer, but I might have maybe done a little bit more of an area that was a little bit too big. If I now break that up and notice more of my highlights and my shadows, I do find that I've completely stopped any of that hesitation during that early building up process. So because I approach it in that way, you can really see here how the skin, it looks like it's got those folds, those creases, where she's got her head turned and it's now making that part of her shoulder scrunch that fur up. So I really do hope the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video have been useful, and as I say, if they were, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. So here is a photo of the finished portrait, 3 beautiful Labradors. I really did enjoy drawing this so much, and because of the questions that I have had on my Facebook page and Instagram since I shared this, I will be making that dedicated Chocolate Labrador tutorial for my Patreon channel, and that will be coming up in the next couple of months. But I will make sure to post any updates to my YouTube community tab here, so I post there every day so you can see what I'm working on. And of course there will be a YouTube tutorial version of that Chocolate Labrador once it does go live on my Patreon as well. So I will be uploading another video to YouTube next week, but this will be my last tutorial for YouTube for 2022. I really do hope that you have a great new year, and I've got so much exciting content that I've got planned for 2023. I really can't wait to share it with you. I would also just like to say a huge thank you to everybody who gives the videos a like, the thumbs up, a comment, a share, all the support I get on Patreon, on my social media. I really do appreciate it. I wouldn't be able to make the tutorials here if it weren't for that support, so I really am grateful. Thank you so much, and I really do hope that you all have a wonderful 2023.